Okay, well, welcome everybody. I'm Jonna Johnson. As you can see, I'm here with Jason Garbis, Chief Product Officer at Appgate, and my colleague John Burke, who is the Chief Technology Officer at Nemertes Research. Welcome everybody. We are here to talk about something I'm sure people are interested in, which is what is the real economic value of zero trust? We've all heard we're supposed to be deploying zero trust, but how do we measure the benefits? What benefits should we be looking for, and how do we measure those benefits? So the three of us have worked together on a project to find out exactly the answer to that. And we put together a project with the goal of understanding and quantifying the business and operational impact of Appgate's SDP Zero Trust Network Access product. What we did is really put together a series of hypotheses. And these hypotheses are non-trivially interesting, as Jason will mention, because it's not just the standard ROI TCO kind of approach to looking at things. Then we interviewed customers to validate or invalidate the hypotheses. We gathered data and then analyzed everything and put together a report. As you'll see, the outcome was an assessment of both the strategic and operational benefits provided by Appgate SDP. And you'll see what we mean by strategic and operational. We also got, as well as getting objective quantitative data, we also got subjective narrative insight as to why people deployed the technology and what benefits it gave them. Just to sort of round things out, we did this earlier this year from March through May. So the process, again, was crafting hypotheses, interviewing customers, analyzing findings, and then creating a report, which you can click on. You can click on the attachments on this webinar or find the link of the Rev report at the link below. Jason, now you and I talked about this quite a bit. It's not all that easy to figure out what to look for when it comes to zero trust benefits. Why is that?
It's a really interesting topic because what organizations are doing with zero trust and their zero trust strategy, of course, is multifaceted. And there are parts of it that lend themselves very well to measurement, which is I'm accelerating this process, I'm doing this thing better. But there's a huge proportion of it that is often new and very qualitative, such as I'm going down a digital transformation for my business, and I want to be able to unlock this new initiative and open the doors for new business and new types of partner integrations, things that we as a business have never done before. And by definition, you're doing something you've never done before. It's very difficult to measure the direct return on that or the efficiency gains for that. Likewise, from an improved security perspective, which of course is a huge benefit, a huge emphasis on what zero trust delivers, is you have improved security. So you're going from somewhere here to somewhere here, we're way up here, and you're doing things again that you haven't done before. So how do you measure the ROI on that? It's definitely a challenge. There are very clear cost savings that we've seen come out of this survey and talking to these customers that we'll go through here. But there's a lot of qualitative things that have tremendous benefit that aren't necessarily trivial or easy to quantify. In some of our prep calls, we were talking about 15 years ago, I was working for another software vendor in the data center server configuration management and automation space. And that was really, really well aligned for these types of ROI analysis, because we were literally taking manual tasks that system administrators and network administrators were doing and automated them based on configuration. So it was very easy to say, oh, you've got X thousand servers and Y people on your administrative team, and they handle Z support tickets a day. On average, these different tasks take this number of minutes or this number of hours. You turn the crank on that, do some kindergarten math, and immediately pops out, oh, you're saving 80 or 90% on, at scale. Zero trust and the types of things that people are doing here are very different than that. But there are some really interesting nuggets and some really valuable benefits that are quantifiable that we'll talk about here.
Excellent. So just to give everybody a little bit of background on who we spoke with, and just a reminder, Jason said survey, but this was really an in-depth interview process. We spoke with companies that were a range of sizes, so anywhere from 40 million to 2.5 billion in revenue or budget if they were not for profit. They were in 2 countries, the US and UK, 7 vertical industries listed here, including not-for-profit. And interestingly, at Nemertes, we like to position organizations based on what we call their technology culture. And the question we ask is, what is the organization's perspective towards technology? At one end of the spectrum, it is conservative, and a conservative organization views technology as, cost savings, primarily cost savings, such as Jason talked about earlier. And really, the only reason to deploy technology is to reduce costs. At the other end of the spectrum is aggressive or leading edge, where technology is viewed as a competitive differentiator or strategic advantage. And there's really 4 buckets that we can pretty quickly characterize organizations by. And what we found is that the organizations we interviewed were typically aggressive, had an aggressive technology culture. They viewed technology as a strategic advantage and competitive differentiator, which is useful to know. And finally, most of them were actually all of them were actively engaged in zero trust implementation. Some considered that they had completed it, but the majority were in the process of completing and expected to complete in about 2022. So with that, John, do you want to talk a little bit about some of the hypotheses that we put together?
Sure. And as Jason was saying, some of them were sort of motherhood and apple pie kinds of hypotheses. When you're bringing in a new tool, that they will in some way improve operational efficiency or make it easier to do thing X in this case being effectively work from home. And of course, during the past 18 months, that's been an especially urgent and important kind of a function to optimize in any way. So we developed hypotheses around the idea that deploying Appgate would make it possible for more people to work from home, would make it more effective for people to be working from home, or make it easier for people to be working from home, for example, and that would improve employee satisfaction, making the process easier, making it work better for them in different places, should make them happier. And likewise, improving operational efficiency, as Jason touched on. There's all these things people do to create new accounts in their environment, make sure that they're being given access to the right resources across environments. And we were looking for significant improvements there for people deploying Appgate, where we're trying to find out if they were able to do things faster, able to do things once and then have it propagate across environments seamlessly. Were they able to do the same amount of work with fewer people, or was there just less work to do? Hypotheses along those lines. Looking at whether Appgate made it possible for people to pursue zero trust in their environment. That was one of the foremost things we were looking to establish, that this would be a gateway to zero trust implementation in a lot of environments. So we formed hypotheses around it would accelerate zero trust, it would make zero trust implementation easier, more consistent, broader across the environment. And lastly, or firstly, if you're looking at this list, that deploying Appgate would in some way accelerate an organization's ability to implement digital transformations. And we've been researching digital transformation for, 6 years now, and have consistently seen that it is about either reimagining how you're using technology or deploying new technology, but in almost every case is mediated by technologies. And in some cases, technologies that require or depend on users accessing your systems from places they haven't done so before, or new classes of users having access to systems that they haven't had before, or being able to much more finely control who has access to what. So looking at what Appgate does, looking for it to accelerate digital transformation made a lot of sense. And so those were the things that we were looking into. We crafted, therefore, a fairly detailed set of questions we wanted to ask people as we interviewed them. And as Jonna mentioned, this was a process of interviews, and she and I did the interviewing. So this was not something that was farmed out to a third party. We did those calls and had those conversations ourselves.
And just to clarify, we went into this hoping that the answers would be the obvious answers, but we wanted to capture the data to see what the data said. And in fact, we spoke with folks about a whole range of use cases. So one of the other hypotheses that we didn't list there, but is also something that bubbled up, was that Appgate users would be deploying the technology in multiple use cases, but that there would typically be a primary use case. And we pretty much got a yes on both. What we did was we asked people what the primary use case that they deployed Appgate for was. And most folks said that it was VPN replacement. I say most folks, the plurality of folks said it was VPN replacement, specifically providing access for remote users to company resources, which could be on the in the cloud or on-prem. Another subset of folks said that they were using it to secure DevOps, providing dynamic access to development environments and code bases. And the remainder said that they were using it, that they were primarily using it to enable cloud migration. But, and this is key, almost all of the folks that we spoke to said that they started with one use case and they were in the process of morphing to more than one use case. We didn't really capture the data on that specifically. It was more one of those anecdotal things where we would ask what the primary use case was and they would tell us that there were additional use cases. So it's kind of interesting for us to see. We expected the VPN replacement to come out paramount. If you'd asked us, I think we probably would have said cloud migration would have been the second one, but it turned out to be securing DevOps.
This notion of having multiple use cases is really common, and that excuse me, very common, and is, I think, actually a very healthy sign of organizations deliberately going down a journey, going down the zero trust journey, because zero trust is not something that's, you do one project and you're done. This is a security philosophy that really is how your organization should be orienting itself from a security perspective, but also from an IT and really from an overall technology perspective. And the VPN replacement, not surprising, has the preponderance of organizations said it's their primary use case because of COVID, but also because it's very much low-hanging fruit. It's very easy to replace, and the benefits are very clear from a user experience perspective and from a security perspective. It's not on its own going to be something that's strategic. Whereas you look at securing DevOps or cloud migration, both of those things are very often tied into these really strategic and really, really valuable digital transformation initiatives as organizations look to move away from traditional data centers or move to a much more modern and higher velocity application architectures that help them do really amazing things to accomplish their business or their organization's mission. So I think it's a really good mixture here. And as organizations move down their zero trust journey, they take on new use cases, as well as they take on much more interesting and dynamic ways to integrate the zero trust platform into their identity system or their SIEM or other types of IT infrastructure.
Well, and Jason, go ahead, John.
I was going to say that's a really interesting point to mention, that there's some interesting flourishes sort of hanging off these primary use cases around impact on other systems or other parts of the infrastructure. And one of the most interesting conversations I had was with a company that was figuring on retiring its private WAN as a result of deploying Appgate. They were looking at what they could do with it across the internet and seeing that it pretty much obviated the need for the private WAN for them to be able to empower users in remote locations to come in across the internet securely in this fashion. And so, first they put their plans to deploy SD-WAN on hold, and then they started planning how they were going to retire their, MPLS connectivity in this case, in favor of just direct internet access and zero trust network access via Appgate.
Well, and it's interesting too, because one of the characteristics of zero trust is you really can't talk just to the security people or just to the network people. As you highlighted, it's that overlap between the network folks and the security folks, because they're making strategic network decisions based on what they can accomplish with security. John, you actually answered the question I was about to ask Jason, which is what is the most striking use case or anecdotal use case? Jason, I don't know if you have one to add. I know John highlighted one. If there's one that sort of sticks out in your mind as surprising, striking, or otherwise memorable?
Yeah, I think the um, the connection of security and secure access to business processes is something that always resonates with folks, and we've seen so many of our customers utilize this. The idea of, for example, controlling access by system administrators to production systems, or even non-production systems, but to do that by tying access to a service desk ticket. So you have a business process, which is there's a ticket that's issued or created, and that indicates, hey, this server or system needs to be updated or reconfigured or patched, whatever the administrative task is. And the system administrators, of course, come to work or turn on their laptop these days. They get tickets assigned to them and they say, okay, great, I have to log into this server over here and update this configuration or apply a patch. On a daily basis, those system administrators may not know which 20 servers out of 2,000 they need to access, but we, at the same time, organizations recognize they don't want those system administrators to have broad network access to all these production servers 24/7 by 365. So by tying access, by using the Appgate SDP system capability to consume those service desk tickets and dynamically adjust access for those administrators based on information stored in the ticket. It codifies the server that needs addressing and the system administrator to whom it's been assigned. They get very precise access that's tied to this business process that they want and need to do anyway. They have an open ticket to server X, they get access to server X, they close the ticket, and that access goes away. So it's a beautiful thing because it enforces the principle of least privilege. It keeps users fully productive, and the security becomes a byproduct of this day-to-day operations. And it's done in a way that's self-documenting from an audit and compliance perspective. So those types of things, that kind of connection across those environments is often really, really powerful and is really one of the most appealing aspects of Zero Trust.
It really is, Jason. And I'm glad you picked that particular one. I was nodding because that's actually the example I always use when I try to get across the idea of what it means to have dynamic privileges in Zero Trust. So let's move ahead and have a look at some of the strategic benefits that folks got from using Appgate SDP for Zero Trust network access. First and foremost, everyone told us, 100% of the folks told us that using Appgate accelerates digital transformation. Now, some of you may be thinking, okay, what does that actually mean? And in all fairness, what we did was we said, do you believe that Appgate helped accelerate your digital transformation? And it was a yes, no question, and all of them said yes. Then we asked questions that were more anecdotal and said, how, in what way? And we'll talk about that in just a second. But we also asked people to give us on a subjective measure on a scale of 1 to 10, where they were on their digital transformation before and where after. And that average improvement, the average improvement on that scale was 119%. So most folks more than doubled where they were on their digital transformation journey. Now, just to be clear, that is a subjective measure. It's kind of a finger to the wind, but sometimes that can be the best way of boiling up a lot of anecdotal and experiential things into one sort of quick metric. And the other thing we asked is kind of, again, a very binary yes, no, is Appgate strategic to Zero Trust? They said yes. And in fact, they rated it on a scale of 1 to 10 as an average of 9.5. So essentially, the organizations that we interviewed found that Zero Trust and Appgate were one and the same thing. In fact, one of them even said Appgate is Zero Trust in a box. That's pretty much the way I think about it. But maybe this is a good time, Jason, for you to talk a little bit about how SDP and Zero Trust, they're two different acronyms. How do they overlap? What's that Venn diagram overlap?
Sure thing. So Zero Trust is a security philosophy and a set of principles around how organizations should be thinking about and approaching security. And it really is something that at its core shifts security from a more traditional and perimeter-centric model of granting implicit trust or implicit access for a user or device just because they happen to be on the corporate network. and shifting it to a model that provides for much more identity-centric and dynamic and context-sensitive access, and also embraces and recognizes the very distributed type of environment, the very heterogeneous type of technology environment that we live in today, with lots of different types of devices that users are using from lots of different locations. And they have a need to access resources that are on a huge variety of technology platforms in what is very often a very geographically distributed type of environment. And traditional security technologies, as we've seen, as we continue to see practically every day from headlines, are really failing to help enterprises secure themselves and prevent attacks and breaches, and also make themselves resilient to breaches. And that's because traditional security is really very much an all or nothing type of thing in terms of network access. And attackers are unfortunately able to take advantage of getting a single foothold on the network and moving laterally and having broad access to a bunch of resources. So what Zero Trust does is it says, okay, let's put in place a principle of least privilege, and let's require the right level of strong authentication and continuous evaluation of the user, device, and system context with a dynamic set of very fine-grained access control policies. So now we know who the user is, we know a lot about them, and based on that, we can provide them with just the right access at just the right time. And the system administrator example we gave a few minutes ago, I think is a great instance of that. So that's what Zero Trust is. The software-defined perimeter is an open security architecture created by the Cloud Security Alliance, which is a nonprofit industry consortium. And that architecture is allows organizations or allows vendors like us to build systems that follow that architecture that meet the Zero Trust principles. So if you look at how SDP works and what it does, it is in full harmony with Zero Trust principles of identity-centric, distributed, and dynamic policies. And in fact, if you look at the most recent Zero Trust documents and architectures published by organizations like the National Institute for Standards and Technology, they clearly mention and give credit to SDP as an architecture that supports Zero Trust.
And I think that's actually a very, very important point, because sometimes people ask us things like, well, what about all these acronyms? There's, SASE, and there's CASB, and there's this, and there's that. How does SDP fit into the universe? And what I usually tell them is SDP is an actual architecture that was created by a nonprofit standards body that has a defined architecture behind it, which instantiates Zero Trust. The others are usually marketing buzzwords that don't have associated architectures and sort of loosely perform the same functions in various different ways. So I think it's important to understand that SDP is an actual architecture and that you can begin building Zero Trust using that architecture.
That's right. That's right. I think there are other architectures that enterprises could consider, and one could embark on and attempt to implement Zero Trust using other architectures. I think there's a lot of trade-offs, and there are many significant advantages to using SDP as an architecture for achieving Zero Trust, because it just aligns so well with the core principles.
Exactly. And it is very well thought out. So we're talking really at a high level about strategy, and strategic benefits, but there are also, we mentioned, one of the hypotheses that we had was that there would also be operational benefits to using Appgate SDP. And before I go through all of these, I want to highlight the fact that every organization that John and I spoke with said that they had at least one, and usually multiple, of these operational benefits. And John, do you want to walk through what some of these are and how people saw them?
Sure thing. So we'd hoped that there would be some advantage in using Appgate to how quickly people could provision user accounts in their environments. And we saw, in fact, that on average, among the folks who had that as a benefit, they did dramatically reduce, over 90% reduction in the amount of time they were spending provisioning user accounts. And that is a time measured in multiple days pre-Appgate to a time measured in hours post-Appgate. And it's also, I think, ideal to note that for the folks who did not cite any improvement in their provisioning time, And I think that was about a third of participants. They either had a fully automated system and Appgate was replacing that as a fully automated system, and so the speeds were about equivalent, or they had never before even tried, because of the time it would take, to really partition user access to backend systems. And so they would just create an account and throw it over into that big amorphous trust bubble that was their data center. And people had access to anything they could reach. So they were replacing that with a much more partitioned and, ideally zero trust approach to it, giving people access to the systems that they needed. And so they saw an increase in the amount of time they were spending, but all for good reason.
Yeah, let's talk about the two provisioning metrics, because it's really interesting. And this is, obviously, Appgate SDP is not a provisioning tool. What it does, however, it enables these organizations to make these, in some cases tactical, in some cases very strategic changes to their overall provisioning, access requests, and approval systems and processes that deliver these kind of dramatic improvements. So, one example, one customer went from, I think it was 5 days to a half a day. No, might even be longer than that. I think it was a couple of weeks, actually. And the reason was that they used to require that their IT department procure a new laptop, actually physically get the laptop, domain join it, install software, et cetera, and then ship it to the user. You can imagine that could take at least 7 to 10 days. And they shifted to a much faster cycle where they would just drop ship the laptop directly from the manufacturer to the user. All the user had to do was install Appgate SDP with the right profile link, and then the system would give them access to the right internal tools. So that provided a tremendous speed up in user access. And the reason they were able to do that was because they could have the system be domain joined, even though it was remote. And around that, they were able to orient and redo the types of access requests and access approval processes that they had, relying on the fine-grained access that they could get versus the broad network access that they had with their traditional VPN.
And I'll throw in another example on the way the mechanics of the reduction worked. Traditional VPNs, appliance-based, and several of the folks that we interviewed accomplished what security partitioning they had by having separate VPNs managed via separate VPN appliances and taking a single account and provisioning it to each of those with the appropriate privileges took them a long time. And using Appgate and controlling that from a single place with a single set of privilege controls eliminated that repetitive and error-prone piece of the work for them, and ultimately allowed them to actually get rid of the VPN appliances as well, although that took a little longer. So right there. And along with these reductions in the amount of time it takes to provision users, we saw that it takes fewer staff as well. For the folks reporting that they were able to use fewer staff hours to provision users, the reduction was about 78, almost 79%. And it goes hand in hand with that ability to provision once instead of multiple times, and to have a higher degree of automation and to eliminate repetitive exercises. So they were able to point those staff resources at other kinds of work instead, and more productive ones than repeating operations across multiple VPNs, et cetera.
Exactly. And if we drill down on what some of those things actually look like in practice, it was a shift away from having multiple siloed application repositories or identity repositories where someone had to look at an access request, approve that, yes, this user, of course, they're going to need access to this application, and then to have someone either on IT or on the application owner team manually make a change or configure someone, and shift that to a much more sensible centralized model where access to those applications were driven by directory group memberships. And then there was a single decision that says, oh yes, we have this new hire, they're on the finance team, in this region, in the US region, put them in that group, and then automatically, because they're in that group, they get access to the 4 or 5 or 8 applications that they need to do their job without having to engage one by one the application owners or the applications themselves. So that type of centralization and automation delivers dramatic improvements while in fact improving security and compliance, because everything is driven by that one process and it's documented and logged and validated.
And before you jump into the login time, John, I want to dig a little bit deeper. Jason, we had a question come up where somebody asked if you could recap that whole notion of dynamic access and dynamic privileges. And I remember when you told me about this the first time and how it worked, I think you used Salesforce as an example. I could be wrong, where the sysadmin was actually a super user for Salesforce. And that was the example that you gave. Is that correct?
I don't recall that specific example,
okay.
But there are lots of situations where we have system administrators who have access or need privileged access. And the dynamic policy model is really at the heart of and provides a huge degree of value around what a zero trust security model does. And the way that we've implemented an Appgate SDP allows these securities to be tied into many different dynamic aspects. So we already talked about the business process and a service desk ticket.
That's exactly what he wanted to have recapped a little bit better. So if I may, Scott, I'll try to get it sort of crisply. Essentially, the idea is that the sysadmin has sysadmin privileges only so long as the trouble ticket is active. It kicks off when the trouble ticket is active, and it turns off again when the trouble ticket is closed out. So then that access, then he no longer has that super user access to come in and do things. It's automatically taken away from him. And I love that because, Jason was talking a minute ago about automation. It increases security, so you don't have to forget, you have to remember to take the super user privileges away. But it also, as you can see, it doesn't take as much staff time to worry about dealing with this stuff if it were manual.
Right. It also significantly increases the resiliency. I mean, imagine this system administrator falls for a phishing link, or they watch a funny cat video that installs malware in their device. And in the old days, that sysadmin would have broad network access to thousands of different servers. And now so does the attacker. Whereas in a zero trust world, that system administrator has no access to any production systems except for the small handful that, today for this hour is granted access. They have access because of the status of the service desk ticket. So it significantly reduces the blast radius and the attack surface for a compromised user, and helps organizations really shift their mindset to, okay, let's assume that we've been breached. How do we make our systems and our operations resilient to that? The other aspect of the dynamic policy model I want to touch on is not just the access, but authentication. In many cases, organizations have and need to enforce multi-factor authentication, but of course, it's a balancing act between user experience and efficiency and security. So the dynamic policy model can look at attributes of the user or their device, their geolocation, time of day, or overall network level. Are we in a green or yellow or a red mode, for example, and be able to dial up or dial down the authentication strength that's necessary for access based on those types of attributes. And finally, the last piece of the dynamic access is the ability for the system to interrogate the target workloads and look at the attributes or metadata for those and grant access accordingly. And this is really an important capability for the DevOps use case, which is having the enforcement point within Appgate SDP, look at the workloads, whether they're in a container environment or cloud environment or traditional on-prem environment. And based on attributes of those workloads, allow or deny access to a user. So you can easily imagine a workload that goes through its life cycle from development to QA to production. And as that attribute of the workload changes, the access that different people have change accordingly. As it shifts from dev to QA, the QA staff now has access to it, but the dev team doesn't. As it goes from QA to prod, no one has access to it unless there's a service desk ticket.
I think that's a really important piece of the puzzle to keep in mind for folks who are looking not just to solve their zero trust access questions, but also do some measure of privileged access management, which is a topic that perennially our clients come to us and ask about, and that has a host of entirely separate products to deal with it, but their lives can be simplified if this level of privileged access management meets their needs, because now they don't have to have multiple products to make it happen. They can make it happen with the same thing they're using to control access otherwise.
Yeah, and the PAM solutions, they tend to be very focused on authentication credentials. And from our perspective, in fact, from a zero trust perspective, that's great. Authentication and controlling access to credentials is certainly necessary, but we don't think it's sufficient or complete, because we really strongly believe that network level access, even if you don't have credentials, is a privilege. The ability to establish a network connection to a server, or even just send a network packet to a server, has been shown to be a very rich attack surface that time and time again has been exploited by attackers. So we think that controlling credentials for access to systems is a good step, but preventing unauthorized network access to those for unauthorized users is equally as important.
Excellent. And we should probably move along and highlight some of the other operational benefits. And then Scott had a further question for you, Jason. But after we wrap this up, I think we can circle back and discuss that, because it's a good question, another good question. So John, I think you were about to talk about the login time.
I was indeed. And again, that's typically been tied to folks who were using Appgate to supplant, to replace their other more traditional VPN approach. They were seeing that it took anywhere from a third to half the time for users to log in that regime, just because typically it was a single kind of a login operation. The same credential would get them through Appgate and into their Windows environment, instead of typically having first a VPN login and then a login into an environment inside their IT infrastructure. So that leads almost directly, plus the reduction in the use of traditional VPNs, to the dramatic reductions in trouble ticketing and access-related security tickets that help desks were having to deal with, because when the process is simpler and more reliable, those trouble tickets tend to decline rapidly. We had at least one customer say they were typically getting over 100 access-related trouble tickets each day, and that dropped to essentially zero after the implementation of Appgate was completed. And that was not all that unusual, dropping all the way to zero. I don't know that anybody else told us that, but they did, drop down into the onesie twosie zone. And, again, typically from tens to hundreds per day. So a massive reduction in the effort expended on the help desk side and the support engineer side, just to get people into the systems they need access to. And lastly, that improvement in scalability. Again, this has typically been associated with uncoupling access from those traditional VPN solutions and getting to the point where you can get more people logging in at the same time without a diminution of performance for users of those backend systems.
Which turns out to be relatively important when you're trying to do anything that centralizes things. But thanks, John. And Jason, I want to circle back one last time. Scott raised an interesting scenario, which is, okay, that explains a lot. But let's say I were a bad Apple system administrator. Wouldn't I just wait till that moment that I had access when the trouble ticket was active and go in and do whatever bad things I was going to do? Or can you control what I can do with that system, as well as whether or not I'm super user at that point?
Yeah, well, the malicious system administrator is a challenge.
Yeah,
sure.
That's what I said.
I think it's fair is that so a couple of things happen in terms of the types of access controls and the policy model. So one is it's going to be restricted to the type of service that can be accessed. So if you're saying, hey, this user can only access a web app, a web administrative app that's running, or they can only RDP to the server. They're not going to be able to utilize other services that are running on that server. And in fact, if they attempt to do so, that can easily be detected and acted upon. The system also gives you the ability, I would say that organizations that are concerned about this, that have it as a risk model, should utilize systems such as a privileged session monitoring system that are designed to act as an application or a session proxy to do things like record that or control what they have access to, if that's important for the risk model.
Yeah, it's the way I understand it is it basically goes so far but no farther, which the so far will actually substantially lock down a lot of the systems. But beyond that, you do need to use additional tools.
Yep.
As always,
right. Well, moving right along. One of the things that we talked about how it makes system administrators' lives easier, reduces the time required to do all sorts of things. But one of the cool things that we all were very impressed with was the impact on employees. Now, what's interesting is we're giving you the 7.8 out of 10 was the average employee satisfaction post Appgate. So your immediate question is, gosh, what was it before Appgate? And the short answer is, it wasn't measured because most of the time employees were really unhappy with the current solutions they had for the problems. And in fact, to the point where they really hated the IT department because getting access was so much of a pain. And so what happened was the IT department really wasn't able to track that. But afterwards, what they were able to pick up was a measurable increase in employee satisfaction so that people said, yeah, this is great. In fact, we love you. It literally went, one guy told us, not quite in so many words, it went from we hate you to we love you, like that degree of happiness. And that's actually something that's very powerful because for remote access, that's usually the thing where you grumble and complain about the IT department the most, particularly in the context of work from home when you don't have help that's readily available. And that's the second of the two things, which is really that Appgate SDP was strategic to work from home initiatives, 8.8 out of 10. And that's actually quite interesting because one of my favorite examples of use cases was a company that went from, because of the particular business it was in, everybody had to be on premise to do their work. And they were doing some computationally intensive work and they had to be on premise because it was highly secure and it was very important to maintain the security architecture. And they couldn't give people access via VPN that would then give them access to multiple systems that they weren't supposed to be seeing because of the nature of the business. Well, what happened was with COVID, these employees could not work on premise. So they had Appgate installed and they were able to gain, as Jason was talking about, just access to the systems they were allowed to gain access to and nothing else. And it was seamless and transparent for them to the point where now that we are, more or less post-COVID, they're actually keeping a substantial percentage of their users remote because the users who are doing, again, this computationally intensive stuff have discovered to their delight that they can be doing it from home. So that's where you see this this strategic to work from home initiatives. And Jason, any further thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think part of the adoption of work from home, or the necessity to shift to work from home, also drove a lot of organizations to in many cases for the first time, accelerate a bring your own device type of policy, because now they can have not just corporate managed devices, but personally purchased devices that securely get access and can have the right level of device introspection, security posture checks, as well as ongoing dynamic controls around, okay, what is this device doing to securely enable work from home? I think for the first point, you mentioned something interesting, and I think it's a really interesting hallmark of a well implemented zero trust initiative is that as the security team starts to roll this out, not only are end users happy, but application owners are clamoring to get their applications onboarded inside of the Appgate SDP infrastructure because it makes it easier for them, because it makes it easier and faster for users. And we've seen that time and time again when after the first project, they end up with their peers across the organization really wanting to be part of this initiative. And I think that's a really key success indicator of success for these security teams.
Excellent. John, any thoughts, or shall we start wrapping up?
Just to reinforce the idea that you highlighted, I think that it is possible for employees who were never able to really work from home because of very strict security requirements, potentially to be able to work from home with this augmented level of security available, and that that can in turn have a significant impact, ripple effect impact on WAN infrastructure and data center network infrastructure. If the WAN shrinks, the data center has less stuff in it as well, and on excuse me, even spending on office space. If people don't have to go into an office, and 80% of them don't anymore, maybe the office shrinks, maybe the office goes away entirely. So these are all knock-on effects of having a really robust and secure authentication and authorization tool in place.
Yeah, and I think that what I would add to that is, from my perspective, one of the things I keep trying to tell clients is, look, the old way of handling work from home was you had telecommuting users who had one system and in-office users who had a totally different system. We don't know exactly how everything's going to shape out over the next couple of years, but one thing I can guarantee you is we're not going to have that bright line distinction between work from home and work in the office, and it'll be the same users. So you want to make sure that the system is absolutely consistent, seamless, and transparent, regardless of where the user is.
And that's another really important thing to talk about, which is the benefit of zero trust is that location, user's location, becomes an attribute, but it doesn't become a driver or a driver of which policy model or which enforcement point is being used. Because for goodness sake, we have all of these on-premises security and networking systems that have had almost no usage in the last year and a half. It doesn't make sense to try to update them or continue to invest in them. Organizations need to and are embracing a zero trust model that provides a single unified access control policy model and enforcement points, regardless of whether a user is at home today or in the office tomorrow or in some other location entirely. That provides such tremendous benefits in terms of efficiency and effectiveness of security and access.
Okay, well, that is it for the prepared slides. We do have another question, which I think is a very relevant question. And folks, please, feel free to continue posting questions. This question is, we talk a lot about the policy. Where does that policy live? Jason, that'd be for you.
Sure thing. The SDP architecture is designed around a very distributed model, but with two clear roles that are very much aligned with exactly how NIST talks about it. So there are a set of distributed policy enforcement points that sit across an organization's network or networks, and are the ones that control access to the resources. These policy enforcement points take direction logically from a set of policy decision points. The policy decision point acts as a point of authentication for the users by connecting to the organization's identity provider, as well as an evaluator of the policy model that it maintains, utilizing data and events from a whole host of enterprise IT and security systems. You can easily imagine this policy decision point, which in the SDP architecture is called a controller, that sits logically at the center. It's connected to your identity provider so that users can authenticate to it. And that identity provider could be a cloud-based SAML solution. It could be a traditional on-premises AD or LDAP type of system. It maintains a policy model, and it also has the ability to connect to and make calls to other elements of your infrastructure. We talked about it making calls to a service desk, for example. It could also make calls to or receive events from a SIM system or an endpoint detection and response system. All of that makes up the context that the policy decision point utilizes to make decisions, not only at the time a user authenticates, but continuously throughout their access. And that's another really important point, which is these systems are really designed to be, I turn on my laptop in the morning, it connects in the background. Maybe I'm prompted for authentication or MFA, maybe not. And I get access and I do my job. And throughout the course of the day, as things change or as things need to get refreshed in the background, my access might change, but it all happens transparently to me as an end user. And that's just a much better outcome than a traditional, oh yes, I have to launch the VPN because I need to access this. Oh, wait a minute, I have to turn off the VPN because it conflicts with that type of model. Oh, my access changed, I have to sign out and sign back in. All of that goes away, and Zero Trust becomes this much more dynamic and adaptive system based on this architecture.
And with that, I think we've got almost all the questions wrapped up. There is one remaining question, John, that I'd like to toss your way, because I know it actually affects or draws on some of the independent research we've done around Zero Trust and Zero Trust deployment. And the question here is really, if I'm moving on my journey towards Zero Trust, where do I start? Do I start by building this policy? Do I start by putting a team together? What's the best place to start as I'm moving on my journey towards Zero Trust?
Sure. And in our secure cloud access and policy enforcement research from May, so it was running, we were generating the output on that roughly parallel to beginning this project. We found that the folks who were most successful in their outward-facing security environment had started with Zero Trust architecture in deploying Zero Trust, and had gotten their Zero Trust architecture set before they moved on to the many tasks that fall out of that, like re-architecting their network or re-architecting their data storage environments. But that defining specific policies came third, really, after all these major re-architectures had begun and when you were into the implementation phase for Zero Trust, basically. So yeah, it's very clear that you've got to start with the Zero Trust architecture aspect of your work before you move on to doing the other things, if you want to follow in the footsteps of the folks who are most successful.
Excellent. Excellent. Well, Jason, I think I'll give the last word to you since you control the button to click us off. Anything else you want to add?
This has been a great discussion, John. So I want to thank you both. I think that there's so many ways to approach Zero Trust and so many ways to be successful with it. So I want to encourage listeners to really start that journey. Think about, what does your Zero Trust architecture look like? What are some of the pain points in your organization that you can address very quickly to build momentum, whether it's a VPN replacement, whether it's securing access to new applications as they're being migrated or created up in the cloud environment, or other types of initiatives. I'd encourage folks to think about the ways in which traditional IT infrastructures and security are really falling short of in today's very dynamic and very threat-heavy landscape. And to recognize that Zero Trust is demonstrably a better way to approach and achieve security. We've seen so many organizations get real benefits out of this. So I think the organizations, security leaders really have an obligation to push and pull their environment, their enterprise forward to a better place. And Zero Trust as an approach is, we really believe, the right way to do this, and to help our organizations and our government entities be much more resilient to the types of attacks that we're undergoing on a daily basis, and to really be able to seize and take advantage of the tremendous technology that's out there for collaboration and development as we work to accomplish our various missions.
And Jason, I lied. You can click the button in just a second, but we got one more question that I think is worth answering. I actually wrote a response to it, but it's a good one. The question was, hey, Jonna, you said that Appgate is Zero Trust in a box. Can you elaborate on that? And I want to clarify, I actually didn't say that. That was one of the Appgate customers, but I do want to highlight the fact that when in our own independent research separate from this project, we found that the most important first step for Zero Trust is building out an architecture. The nice thing about Appgate is that Appgate SDP has an architecture. It's based on the SDP architecture, so it gets you a good chunk of the way there. I won't say it gets you all the way through Zero Trust. You heard, Jason talk about how, there are going to be other components that you need to integrate into your SDP, but it's a really jump start because it's based on on the SDP architecture, which is in fact an instantiation of zero trust, as NIST says. So it's kind of like it's a jump start to get that architecture built, which then you can then do the work that John talked about, re-architecting the rest of your environment to align with zero trust. So that's my answer for that particular question. And I think it's a wrap.